Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Turning Readers into Writers with Emma Desi. And today I have a marvelous interview coming up for you with my good friend, Michele Tracy Berger. Michele is a professor, she's an award-winning writer, she's a creativity coach, and she's a pug lover. Her main love is writing speculative fiction, though she is also known to write poetry and creative nonfiction as well. A few places her work has appeared is A Hundred Word Story, Glint a Literary Journal, The Wild Word, Apex Magazine, Blood and Bourbon, FIYAH, the magazine of Black speculative fiction, Ms. Magazine, and various anthologies. Much of her work explores psychological horror, especially through the issues of race and of gender. Doll Seed is her debut collection of speculative stories, and it's going to be published by Aunt Lute Books in October 2024 in the States and November 2024 here in the UK. So welcome, Michele. So lovely to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm just thrilled to be back with you. I think this is my third time, so I feel very, very lucky.
I think you're right. I think it is the third time. And every time you come and I haven't read your new bio, there's more and more impressive stuff to add to it. So it's always great to catch up with you because you never stop. You're always busy, whether you're moving house, moving state, moving job, or writing a new book. There's always something going on. And so I'm keen to talk to you today. I'm really interested to talk to you about your new anthology, Doll Seed. And for our viewers, do please go and check it out because the cover is to die for. I absolutely love that cover. But I was really curious about what the starting point for this anthology was, because if you're writing a novel, you've maybe got one scene in your head or one idea in your head. But if you're doing an anthology, there's maybe one overarching theme or lots of different stories. How did it start for you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I really consider myself a novelist. And my journey around these short stories was that for a long time, I didn't really know how to write short stories. Every short story I wrote became, a novella, a novelette. And so over the years, as I learned more about the kind of precision that I wanted in short fiction and long fiction, I just started to develop these stories. And when I looked at them over time, there are 15 stories. I was like, oh, I've published enough. I have a collection. So what most people do is they do a novel first and then they do short stories. I love breaking the rules. Like I love these stories. And I'll say the title story, Doll Seed, came after it's a story. So all the work is speculative. And it covers, science fiction, contemporary fantasy, magical realism, weird, horror. And the title story, Doll Seed, was a story that I wrote a while ago. And it took me, Emma, a long time to get it published. And it's a story that it tries to ask what was the inner life of the dolls that were part of the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation case. So it includes like civil rights. It's set in the 1950s, but it's this hierarchy around toys and dolls, and I get to play with a lot of things. So anyway, I was putting the story out, getting some feedback. And I like to tell people that sometimes as a writer, especially if you're doing things kind of on the edge of different arenas, you can be too early. And so the story kept getting rejected, like over a period of time, like, are they like, I really like this, but we don't like this. But I just kept at it. And then that story was published in FIYA magazine of Black speculative fiction, and it went on to win an award. So it was published in 2019 and then went on to win an award. And so that's the heart of the collection, but the collection itself also deals with girlhood and relationships and being an ordinary person having extraordinary things happen, which is kind of my definition of speculative work. But it definitely has a perspective around alternate history,
Mhm.
thinking about issues of anti-blackness, racism, the intersection of race, gender, and class.
Mhm.
The other story that's in there that I'll just say that's a longer story is from it's called Nucia, and basically it's set in the late 70s, early 80s. It's set in the Bronx, and it's about a young Black girl who wins an extraterrestrial. So we've made contact with a group, and there's kind of they do a contest and say, who is going to host this extraterrestrial, and they are chosen. Lindsay, she just wants like a best friend, basically. She's kind of a challenged little girl, and so she wins this diplomatic contest, and her family is chosen. They're the first Black family chosen to host this alien. And through the story, I like to say it's kind of this almost anti-ET story. So it's not necessarily the happy alien that gets integrated and everyone loves. The family faces a lot of challenges and discrimination, and Lindsay has to come into her own in how this extraterrestrial, this alien, is something really different than what they thought. So anyway, so I get to play with a lot of different themes of inclusion, otherness, girlhood through
Mhm.
these stories.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. And for those of us that don't know, you at the top there you mentioned Doll Seed is sort of inspired by the brown dolls, I think you
Yeah,
said.
yeah. So the Brown versus Board of Education was the landmark decision in the U.S. to basically say that segregation was wrong, and it was 1954, and they actually used psychological research that had kids, Black kids and white kids, look at different dolls, Black and white dolls, and what they found in that series of psychological tests was that not only that more times than not only did the white children choose the white doll, like very, similar dolls, Black and white girl dolls, boy dolls, but also the Black children preferred the white dolls. And so that was one of the pieces, along with the other things that were going on in terms of what they could prove harm to Black individuals for this segregation. And I always thought, well, what happened to those dolls? And also the challenges of, I think dolls, I'm just personally interested in dolls and humans relationship with dolls. So I always thought about like what happened to those dolls after the test, and who were those dolls? So that became an entryway to build the story around that larger theme of what happens to this Black doll
Mhm.
that comes kind of from another time to some degree, inhabits this doll body, and then kind of goes on this journey. So I take this reader on the journey through that kind of landscape of the 1950s through the 1960s.
Okay, very turbulent times. And so the stories in your anthology, do most of them come from something that you've read about or studied about in terms of history, and it's been the jumping off point for the story, or has some of it just been, hey, what if, and gone from there?
A lot of the kind of what if, I mean, I think it's a mix of well, I should say what I like about the collection is that people get some flash fiction, they get some shorter pieces, they get some, the kind of traditional short story format of two to 5,000 words, and then they get some longer pieces. But they also kind of move through these different themes that I've been talking about. And I would say I have a lot of like, what if, like, for example, what if a wishing well emerged out of nowhere in the kind of in a neighborhood, an urban neighborhood, and like how would that, how would people treat that? So I have like one of those, what if stories, but some of the work also kind of gets into, I would say, history or ideas that I have questions about history.
Mhm.
My grandmother worked at, for a short time, she was a dancer at the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. So I have a sort of alternate history story with about Zora Neale Hurston and the Cotton Club in the late 20s, early 30s. So I like to kind of play with some historical detail and then, see where that goes. But there are also stories that are don't come from my own experience per se, or don't come from, particular historical incident.
Oh, such super imagination. I don't have quite that imagination that you've got to be able to take something and reframe it and reshape it and kind of play around with it in that same way. Maybe one day I have a kind of long-term vision that I would like to take part of my own family history and turn that into some kind of story. But I have to say
Do it.
I
Do
have a fear
it.
about it. I have a real fear about it. I don't know why. It's very peculiar to me because at its heart, it's just another story, but it's just
Yeah.
taking something and playing with something that's true, taking something that exists and then expanding upon it.
Well,
But
and if I can offer too, if as you think about that, it's the emotional truth, right? So it's
Mhm.
especially if you're going to do historical fiction or even speculative work, it is thinking about what's the emotional truth as related to any kind of family, issues. And for the story that I was just talking about, my grandmother, even though she's not figure in the story per se, I remember hearing stories about what it was like to work at the Cotton Club, which was, this great jazz place, but also she was a lighter skinned she was a tall, light-skinned woman, and she they used to they called dancers hoofers, and she sort of stood in the back, but she was tall and pretty and light-skinned. And I remember hearing stories about colorism in the Black community and how that affects. So that was kind of in the back of my head, and I think there's some kind of emotional resonance that I was trying to get at, and so that might be true, not using the sort of facts of your family's history, but kind of like, oh, what were they struggling with, or the joyous things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good way of approaching it. And sort of, I guess, offering, getting to the humanity of those people rather than what they actually did or did not do, the sort of day to day. Yeah. Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, You mentioned too at the beginning there that one of the ways that this collection came around was because you were looking to sort of hone your skills and improve your craft as a writer. And certainly, I hear this from short story writers that, it really does do that, that you have to be so much more precise with the words that you use, the shape of the story that you're telling, particularly if you're doing the shorter pieces like flash fiction and things. Can you kind of remember one or two of the things that doing these short stories really did help you with that you can use in your longer form fiction as well?
Hmm. I love that. I feel like I have to earn the readers, from the first sentence with short fiction. And this is, you and I have also, we've talked about submitting work and how important it is when an editor is looking at your work, they're usually looking at the first 6 lines. And so short fiction really trains us to I feel like earn the reader's engagement every single line, every single sentence. And not that you're not doing that in the novel, obviously, ideally you're doing that overall, but with short fiction, you're kind of honing the precision of that. And, I have written poetry. I don't consider myself a poet, but poets labor, they can labor months over a word or two, right? And I do feel like when you're writing short fiction, once you're in that revision honing stage, it really is about not necessarily making it minimalist, but really thinking about um, the emphasis on both the sentence, the construction of the sentence, and then the scene, right? And how powerful the scenes have to be. Whereas in the novel, the reader's going to fill in some things, but you have more ways to share things with the reader. In short fiction, it's so compressed that you really have to say, okay, I have to craft the scene so that when we get into the next scene, they've already filled in some things that there's clarity here so that they can move with me and I'm not doing a lot of exposition, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And I will say what I loved working with. So, these are 15 stories. Some are new, a couple of them are new, but most have been published in the last decade in some way, shape, or form. We went back, had such good editors at Aunt Lute Books, and and these are, published stories, refined stories, and there were more things to really think about the reader, and they were coming at it as they have been primarily a literary and or a nonfiction press, and so they were coming at some conventions a little bit differently than literary and genre, and obviously they overlap,
Mhm.
but they were just really we were working quite a bit on what is the reader's making sure the reader isn't confused and what's the reader's experience. So paying attention to the craft of the language, but also making sure the reader can move through easily. And I just think short fiction gives you an entry into that that's really helpful
Yeah.
for doing the longer work.
Lovely. I love that. I love that. And I love that you were able to discover new things about the stories that you had written. And that is a joy to be able to kind of uncover more layers that are there that you didn't even realize were there perhaps when you first wrote it. And I think that is a really great example of why it's so important to hire an editor. It doesn't matter if you're going traditional or you're indie, it's worth, as an indie, investing in that editor because it is a craft lesson in itself. It's a craft course in itself, working with an editor and seeing what they pick up and what they show and the questions that they ask about the words that
Absolutely.
you've got. So it's worth the investment. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And then because you've also engaged with editors and supported writers that, different editors also come with their own wonderful sense of the work and their own biases. And I think as writers working with different editors over time, you get to see some, the shaping of your kind of literary landscape. You get to have kind of really different experiences with the editor that one of the editors I work with is much younger generationally than me, and they were picking up some themes or had some questions about the way I had phrased things that it wouldn't even occur to me because I'm like, I'm a child of the late 70s and 80s, and I'm like, well, I have something about drug use, and I don't refer to people in a malicious way, but they were like, oh, well, why are you kind of hyper focused in your language on this as opposed to this? And I was like, have to sit with that. Sit with that.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, you have to sit with that. I think that is a good lesson for all of us. When an editor has a comment, we sit with it.
We
Think about-
try to.
Yeah.
And then we text our friend, I don't understand why they're asking me to do X, Y, and Z. And the good writing princess, just sit with it. Just
I love it. I love it. Oh, it's so emotional. Um, One of the things I know you love, or a genre that you love, is horror. You've got a real kind of love for that. And when we've been talking before, you brought a new term to me, which I had never heard before, and that was elevated horror. And so I wondered if you'd just kind of chat to us a little bit about that. Is this a new genre or a renamed genre or a subgenre? What's going on there?
right. So I just will say the kind of funny thing. I thought of myself as writing for years and years and years, sort of science fiction, speculative fiction. And it wasn't until about a decade ago, actually, that, or maybe not quite a decade ago, but like I was talking with some other writer folks and they were like, well, you kind of, everything you do kind of has a bit of a dark fiction, horror angle. And it was just funny to me because I was like, oh, so I feel like I've kind of claimed that term. But in the last decade, this idea of elevated horror, social horror, is referring to particularly horror media, TV and film, and films that take the landscape of horror and do something different. So beyond the jump scares and the blood and gore, which is what a lot of people associate horror as. Horror really is a feeling, but as a larger genre, it's very broad and very deep. But when a lot of people think about horror, they think about the 1980s slasher or the Purge films, which there's room for everyone. But social and elevated horrors referring to movies like The Witch, Get Out, The Babadook, which deals with trauma often. It
Okay.
deal intergenerational trauma, sexual abuse trauma, um, and dealing with more of the tone, atmosphere aspects of horror as opposed to kind of the overt kind of fear and terror, a little bit more um, nuanced and layered.
Mhm.
And so and Hereditary, if people have seen that film,
Mm.
Midsummer. So that sense of a little bit of art house, what we would think of from the 60s and 70s art house, but that aesthetic now is really strong. And this, to me, the social horror part is also about people who have not been recognized as writing in horror or writing about themes, women more broadly, people from, underrepresented communities, how they're breaking in both in fiction and media to tell new stories that deal with rethinking slavery or rethinking colonization or rethinking, the elements of joy in the landscape of oppression. So that's also how people are thinking about this elevated horror, social horror. And there's debate, Emma, because no one can agree about anything about, like, is it a new genre? Is it an extension? But I do think I think directors and producers and writers are trying to do something a little bit different,
Mhm.
even though some of those aspects of horror were already there and more nuanced, but in terms of what people commercially think about horror. So that's why this feels a little bit different.
Okay, so yeah, it feels like it's a more sophisticated horror where it's not just I'm thinking of like the old Stephen King ones where it's just
Yeah.
about what's happening
Yes.
there, the physical
Yes.
fear, the physical
Yes.
thinking of
Yes.
for
Yes. Yes.
example.
Yes. Even, yeah,
Okay.
even though that's, all great stuff. And, Stephen King, I think at some of his work was trying to, talk about societal things. It definitely, it would, like you said, it's much more about that was much more about place, region, a family. Whereas, yeah, there's a little bit more about the social, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And just as terrifying. I haven't been able to watch, what was it, Close My Eyes and Hereditary. There was
oh gosh, that's whoo, that did you, so you saw it, you did see
I
it.
saw the trailer, I went, nope,
Oh,
I don't think I can watch that. That the trailer was terrifying.
let me tell you that. And I'm not someone who scares necessarily easy. That film was so intense because it's got trauma, demonic possession, a family, mother, daughter. Like, it's deep. And then I guess that same director did Midsummer, which was also a very intense film. So yeah, I don't.
Gotta be have the right constitution for it, I think. Yeah.
But so worth it when you're in the mood and ready to do it. So those films are pretty. Or The Witch. I don't know if you've seen The
I
Witch.
haven't seen The Witch, no. As you can tell, I'm a
Yes.
bit of a
Is it?
wuss. So
That's
it's
okay.
funny, true crime I can watch, thriller, murder, all of that I can watch that is much more real, like it's much more likely to happen. But put some kind of
Supernatural, paranormal,
yeah.
right? Well,
I,
if yeah, if I can just put a plug in quickly for The Witch now, which I've seen twice because I made my sister see it. It basically is about this isolated family in the 1700s that gets cast out from the community, and they're in the wilds of New England, the woods of New England, and it really takes seriously some of the legends and ideas about the witch. But part of what's amazing about that film is that, is it a descent into madness? Is it also supernatural? There's trauma, there's, stuff about gender. Anyway, so and but there's a lot of historical accuracy from what I understand about the time period, and so it's really
oh,
cool.
interesting then. Yeah.
It might enjoy that.
I'll go and look at the rating and go from there. Oh, lovely. Well, thanks for clearing that up because I think it's just shows how there are periods in cultural history where things shift and change and take a step forward. I'd say the 70s were probably one of those, sort of in terms of movie and TV and things. And it feels like the this decade as well is a time when things are shifting and changing and what we want to see and how we relate to story is changing as well. Yay.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
I'm going to change tack a little bit because
Okay.
before we finish up, I did just want to ask you about your experience of working with a small publisher, which you did with Aunt Lute on Doll Seed. Every writer's experience with the publisher is different, but I'm always curious to know how yours was with this particular publisher.
Mm. They have been so amazing. So I knew about Aunt Lute because I'm a women's and gender studies professor, and I used a lot of their texts, and they published amazing people. They used to publish fiction a long time ago. So as I was putting together the collection, and I was submitting it, and I was also submitting it to presses that had contests where if you won, you got to get published, which I highly recommend, for because those are usually, they're not very expensive to enter, and they're juried, and it's great. And I was getting, Emma, for years, like, like the alternate slot, or it's not quite right for us, and just you're taking that in. But I was like, I'm determined, I believe in the work. And then I saw that Aunt Lute had opened, this is I think the beginning of middle of 2022, they were actually doing an open call, right? And I was like, they describe themselves an intersectional press, they're a feminist press. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're thinking about fiction. So I wrote the most intense cover letter. I was like, I am your person. You're not yet publishing in speculative fiction and Afrofuturism, and here's why I think my work would fit, and blah blah blah. And I was like, I've taught your books. I wrote this amazing cover letter. I didn't hear anything for like 6 months, and then they sent an amazing email. They were like, no, the first they said, is the collection still available? We've been backlogged. So that was like December 2022. And I was like, yes, the collection's still available, because I sent just a sample. So anyway, submitted it, and then they were amazing. They were like, we want this. We love this. The whole press had read it. And I think one of the advantages of working with a small press is that they're not juggling 60 titles.
Mhm.
And so when, for all the writers who are watching this, who want to do collections or chapbooks, you finding the right editor and finding the right press, they're out there. So I would probably say over the years, I've probably cleared at least 30 to 40 presses maybe, but they were the right ones. And so they have a very thoughtful editorial process where I was working with the senior, actually the executive director, who also did the editing, and then an associate editor. Amazing. And then they have a long proofing phase. So it was at the standard and the level that you would have at a more traditional press. And but the love, I just can't, I want to say so they're juggling things. They were disrupted like many small presses were. You and I were talking about this before, in April of this year. A major small press distributor. So unlike the traditional publishers who can put books in their warehouse, most small presses contract out with a distributor to get their work out. And so this main distributor, I guess, went bankrupt or decided they weren't no longer in the business. It affected 450 presses.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah, and in the UK, the US, 400, between 400 and 450 presses. Aunt Lou was affected. However, they had enough of a buffer. So a lot of presses saw 3 to 6 months of um, their earnings gone.
Oh, wow.
And so, small presses, they're not operating on million dollar budgets. Some of those small presses really had challenges if they, didn't have, um, some extra capital. But I
Yeah.
was really fortunate that Aunt Lute, they were also in the midst of shifting. Their long-standing ED was retiring. They just got on it, and they were amazing. There was an author who had a book coming out 3 days after this had happened. And they, as a press, the operations manager, the publicity person, they were, I don't know where they got those books, but they made sure that that author had books for the reading. So I just feel like the incredible professionalism of, and I've worked with other small presses, just that there's a lot to recommend. And obviously you have to do your due diligence,
Mhm.
but please, don't count small presses out, because if they really love your book, they're going to find ways to support you.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I've heard about small presses. Absolutely, that it's almost better to be taken on by them, or it's almost more validating to be taken on by them, because they have a small house, they only
Yes.
take the books that they really, really love and get absolutely right behind. So
Yes.
there might not be the budget of Penguin Random House, but you are going to get like the service that you would not get as a debut author at Penguin Random House. I've got a friend who's got a book coming out this month in September as we
Mm,
record. And
mm,
she's exactly had the same thing, small
mm.
press, really small, but they have loved her book and they have really got behind her and supported her. And so I sort of echo your sentiment about them. I'm so glad it's worked out. I'm so glad it has
Yeah.
for you. Yeah.
I can't say enough good things. I really, and I think small presses too have to be innovative with their marketing. I don't know if your friend is finding this, but because they can't do some of the things that the traditional presses do. So I find that they're just creative and like, hey, we're going to do some Instagram lives. We're going to reach out to micro influencers. So your friend is probably going to find that the marketing is going to be fun and different and a way in that will look different than if working with a bigger press.
Yeah, but just because it's different doesn't mean it's not as good. Yeah, 100%.
Oh,
Yay. Oh, I can't
oh,
believe we've run out of time. I could
I
sit and
know.
listen to you for forever. You're so knowledgeable.
Oh,
Um,
I feel the same. I could love all the questions. I love our conversation. So,
well, we'll have to get you back because we didn't get through all of the questions, so we'll have to kind of reconvene at another time. But listen, Michelle, good luck with the launch. I know you're going to rock it. I know it's going to be amazing, and I can't wait to see
oh,
what happens for you going forward. So thanks so much for giving me
oh,
some of your time today.
oh, thank you so much, Emma. This was amazing. Thank you so much.